Pedra Branca can also be called as Pulau Batu Putih. In Portuguese, Pedra Branca means white rock or refers to bird droppings on the rock. Pedra Branca is composed of a small outcrop of granite with an area of approximately 8,560 square meters at low tide. The area of Pedra Branca is very small compared to Penang, a state in Malaysia.
Perdra Branca is an island located at the east entrance of Strait of Singapore, about 24 nautical miles east of Singapore. The British colonial government took possession of the island over 160 years ago to build a horseboat lighthouse and other structures on it. Since then, Singapore has exercised continuous sovereignty over the entire island and its adjacent waters.
Malaysia and Singapore will begin negotiations on delimiting
judgment
the
over the area
boundaries.
where the International Court of Justice awarded
We are doing some rethinking about that. Actually,
some documents there that may be relevant to this case.
The Perdra Branca dispute was a territorial dispute between Singapore and Malaysia over several islets at the eastern entrance to the Singapore Strait. The dispute began in 1979. In early 1980, Singapore lodged a formal protest with Malaysia in response to a map published by Malaysia in 1979 claiming Perdra Branca. In 1989, Singapore proposed submitting the dispute to the ICJ. Malaysia agreed to this in 1994. In 1993, Singapore also claiming the nearby islets Middle Rocks and South Ledge. In 1998, the two countries agreed on the text of a special agreement that was needed to submit the dispute to the ICJ. The special agreement was signed in February 2003 and the ICJ formally notified of the agreement in July that year. The hearing before the ICJ was held over 3 weeks in November 2007 under the name Sovereignty over Perdra Branca, Middle Rocks and South.
Singapore argued that Perdra Branca was terra nullius and that there was no evidence the island had ever been under the sovereignty of the Johor Sultanate. In the event the court did not accept this argument, Singapore contended that sovereignty over the island had passed to Singapore due to the consistent exercise of authority over the island by Singapore and its predecessor, the United Kingdom. The actions taken included selecting Perdra Branca as the site for Horsburgh Lighthouse and constructing the lighthouse, requiring Malaysian officials wishing to visit the island to obtain permits, installing a military rebroadcast station on the island, and studying the feasibility of reclaiming land around the island. Malaysia had remained silent in the face of these activities. In addition, it had confirmed in a 1953 letter that Johor did not claim ownership of the island and had published official reports and maps indicating that it regarded Perdra Branca as Singapore territory. Middle Rocks and South Ledge should be regarded as dependencies of Perdra Branca. However, Malaysia argued that Johor had the original title to Perdra Branca, Middle Rocks and South Ledge. Johor had not ceded Perdra Branca to the United Kingdom, but had merely granted permission for the lighthouse to be built and maintained on it. The actions of the United Kingdom and Singapore in respect of the Horsburgh Lighthouse and the waters surrounding the island were not actions of the island's sovereign. Further, the 1953 letter had been unauthorized and the official reports and map it had issued were either irrelevant or inconclusive.
International Court of Justice (ICJ) is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It was established in June 1945 by the Charter of the United Nations and began work in April 1946. The court's role is to settle in accordance with international law, legal disputes submitted to it by states, and to give advisory opinion on legal questions referred to it by authorized United Nations organ and specialized agency.
The court agreed with Malaysia that the Johor Sultanate had original title to the Perdra Branca, rejecting Singapore's argument that the island was terra nullius. It was found that it was not disputed that Johor had established itself as a sovereign state with a certain territorial domain in Southeast Asia since it came into existence in 1512. As Perdra Branca has been always known as a navigational hazard in the Singapore Strait, which was a vital channel for international navigation in east-west trade between the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, it was inconceivable that the island had remained undiscovered by the local community. It was therefore reasonable to infer that the Perdra Branca lays within the general geographical scope of the Johor Sultanate. Furthermore, during the existence of the old Johor Sultanate, there was no evidence of any competing claims over the islands in the Singapore Strait. It also agreed with Malaysia's submission that descriptions of the relationship between the Sultan of Johor and the Orang Laut in the 19th century official British reports prove that the Sultan exercised sovereign authority over the Orang Laut. Since the Orang Laut made the islands in the Singapore Strait their habitat, this confirmed the ancient original title of the Johor Sultanate to those islands, including the Perdra Branca. As regards to Singapore's argument that the traditional concept of Malay sovereignty was based on control over people rather than territory, the court observed that sovereignty comprises control over persons and territory. However, it was not necessary to deal with the point further as it had already found that Johor had territorial sovereignty over Perdra Branca. Nevertheless, the ICJ noted that under certain circumstances, sovereignty over territory may pass due to the failure of the state which has sovereignty to respond to the other state conduct attire their souverain, that is, concrete manifestations of the display of territorial sovereignty by the other state. Because there was no written agreement relating to Horseborn Lighthouse and Perdra Branca, the court was unable to determine whether the lighthouse was built under the consent of the Johor Sultanate. Similarly, the fact that Britain had not informed Johor about its decision to site the lighthouse on Perdra Branca might be seen either as recognition that Britain only had consent to build and operate it, or that Johor no longer had rights over the island. On the evidence adduced, the court was unable to reach a conclusion on the issues. With all in mind, on 23 May of 2008, the ICJ rendered its decision. It held by 12 votes to 4 that sovereignty over Perdra Branca belongs to Singapore. It further held by 15 votes to 1 that sovereignty over Middle Rocks belongs to Malaysia, and the sovereignty over South Ledge belongs to the state in the territorial waters of which it is located.
On 23 May 2008, former Malaysian Foreign Minister Rais Yatim described the ICJ decision as creating a win-win situation and that both countries would forge ahead in their bilateral relationship. Deputy Prime Minister during that time, Najib Tun Razak, called the judgment a balanced decision as Malaysia had been partly successful in its territorial claims. Interviewed by journalists at The Hague, Singapore Deputy Prime Minister S. Jayakumar said that they are pleased with the judgment because the court had awarded sovereignty over Perdra Branca, which is the main feature in dispute, to Singapore. Prime Minister of Singapore Lee Hsien Loong said he was pleased with the result and commented that bringing the dispute to the ICJ was a good way for Malaysia and Singapore to resolve disagreements or problems while maintaining good relations with each other.
Although Malaysia and Singapore accepted the decision of the International Court of Justice and even a win-win decision, but on 2 February 2017, Malaysia applied to the ICJ pursuant to Article 61 of the Statute of the ICJ for the revision of the 2008 judgment on the basis of 3 documents it had obtained from the National Archive of the UK between August 2016 and January 2017. The documents were internal correspondence of Singapore's colonial government in 1958, an incident report submitted by a British naval officer in the same year, and a 1960s map of naval operation bearing annotation. The Malaysian government said that these documents indicated that officials at the highest levels in the British colonial and Singaporean administration appreciated that Perdra Branca did not form part of Singapore's sovereign territory during the relevant period. Therefore, the court would have been bound to reach a different conclusion on the question of sovereignty of Perdra Branca had it been aware of the new evidence. However, according to Shariman Lokman, a senior analyst at Malaysia Institute of Strategic and International Study, there's very little precedence for revision to ICJ judgment. Reports suggest that the timing of the application coincides with the upcoming elections in Malaysia, as the ruling Barisan Nasional Coalition, which is currently under pressure over the 1MDB scandal, could use the renewed legal fight over the Perdra Branca as a means to show it was best placed to display strong leadership in the country's foreign policy so as to safeguard Malaysia's sovereignty.
In conclusion, the dispute on Perdra Branca has not yet ended in a perfect way. Until now, although Singapore has obtained the sovereignty of the Perdra Branca, the International Court has also judged the dispute between the two countries to be settled in the future. However, Malaysia had worked very hard to fight for the sovereignty of Perdra Branca until today.